You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by me, Jay Reckward, my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this podcast for my son, Benjamin Jacob Reckward, but we know that there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're releasing these podcasts for free out on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing really well. I'm actually excited about tonight's episode because I think we have a really good story to review and really dig into. We're looking at Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 2, Episode 6, The Schizoid Man, which debuted on January 23rd, 1989, and the star date for this one is stardate 42437.5. There's a lot to really dig in on the essence of the soul. It really is a data episode, but before we get into it, what did you think? Now that we're kind of getting into the first quarter, we're really kind of past the first quarter of season 2. How do you think these episodes are shaping up? How do you think this episode is compared to the rest? And what are your general thoughts before we really kind of get into it?
Well, it's what we have seen in season 2 that the writing's a lot tighter, the stories are more focused. And I think this one's really tight because, as you said, and as I said in my notes, I think there's a lot about the story's a lot about the humanness of Data, but it also gets into by it looking at Data's humanness as what it really means to be human. And then the episode brings up some questions of immortality and what that is.
I think the question of immortality is one that we're going to have to ponder a lot on. But as you said, it's a data episode and also very focused, as a lot of these episodes in season 2 have tended to be. One thing that I do have to say about this episode that I really enjoy is kind of the simplicity of the staging itself. There's not a lot of tech, besides the idea of Ira transferring his consciousness to Data and then to a computer. There's not like a lot of peripheral things or props being used. It really is kind of these simple scenes. Some of them are 10 forward, some of them are on the holodeck. I'm sorry, on the transporter pad. Um, I, Graves' world and Ira's lab seems very simple. It really is kind of the characters just interacting with each other and telling this very dark and very complex human narrative that I think is really well done in terms of just how minimal the story is. Because
Right.
it feels like a lot of season 1 required a lot of peripheral things. Like the one that I'm thinking of immediately is, you had to have kind of a goop creature on Vegra 2.
When you're saying that, I just think a lot of the stories in the multiple stories in episodes in season 1, it was like you were doing gymnastics all the time.
Right.
And now you're just almost like sitting down and watching a well-designed story. It's much more relaxing in a sense. But there's a depth to the thought.
Right. And I think that you hit on a word that I think resonates a lot with the Star Trek fandom. A lot of people watch this. A lot of people watch Next Generation actually to go to sleep. And I remember the earliest memories of you and I watching this show we would watch it really late at night when it was on syndication on Fox. And it'd often be the show that I fell asleep to. So I think in some ways there is this really kind of calming effect that Next Generation has, and that these stories are able to kind of induce in the viewer. And kind of touching on that for a second, typical sci-fi really does kind of have, rocket ships and lasers, or if you're in the Star Wars vein, laser rifles and lightsabers. Star Trek seems unique, especially when it comes to Next Generation in particular, in terms of telling stories where the conflict is not necessarily violent.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is so compelling to an audience?
Um, it gets back to, like you said, if you look at the Star Wars genre, it's very action oriented, sort of violent. Um, the viewer has to expend a lot of emotion when he's
Mm,
watching Star Wars, as where you don't necessarily have to put as much emotional investment into watching Star Trek, because I was thinking about this very thing, that it's a science fiction genre with Star Trek Next Generation, and a lot of them, but it's using the science fiction venues, these future venues, which are very much based on the technology of the future and so forth, to, I think, get the viewers to think about, you know where are we going as humanity? What does it
hmm
mean to be human? Um, like, for instance, the story of the Borg. If you compare Borg society, Borg culture to human culture, having that uh, comparison and contrast, kind of like it's holding up a reverse mirror to humans as to
Right,
who are we and what do we really want to be? Do we want to evolve like these people? What is the value to the humanness we have?
right. I it's so interesting that you bring up the Borg and bring up the question of, do we want to evolve into this kind of collectivist techno-organic race versus do we want to lose our humanness? Because at the center of this episode really is the question of not only immortality, but what is humanist, or our innate humanity attached in some way to the idea that we have a we do have an existential end in some way, shape, or form. Maybe only physical, because I think the episode here posits that in the Star Trek universe, the only end that is certain now is a physical one. I think this episode kind of certifies that, like, there's not necessarily an end to consciousness, and there may not be an end to the soul, and there may not be an end to the spiritual aspect of things. But in terms of there being like a physical body, I think that this episode posits that, there does have to be a physical end to things. And maybe that is
Yes.
reflecting, of humanist things, but also naturalistic things. You know, as as grim as it is to think about, we do have to contend with the fact that we live in a universe that one day will experience a heat death. And everything that we are talking about now, in some ways, and this is very heavy to say, but I don't want anyone at home or Ben who's listening to this to find any sort of thing to work, be anxious about. But this heat death kind of certifies that everything that we do has a finite end to it, and what we make of ourselves kind of has more importance now in the fact that it won't last forever and it won't be around for all times. So it's so much more important, I think, to value the things that we have and the experiences that we go through and the lives that we lead, because and maybe I'm jumping way too far ahead before we get into the episode, but the loss of the finiteness takes something away from us that's really integral to our sense of self.
Well, stop right there and sort of give the listeners,
Right.
the setup, because there's a comment I want to make just based on what you just said about Graves, but we need to set the story up first.
Right. So to set the story up, I'm going to give the story, but then I also kind of want to give a little biography on Dr. Ira Graves real quick, if that's okay.
Sure, yes.
Okay. So, the Enterprise D is being called to Graves World, where Dr. Ira Graves, a prominent scientist in cybernetic technology, has sent out a distress call. It has been picked up, and the crew is rushing to his aid. However, um, en route, another distress call is picked up from the USS Constantinople, which is carrying 2,012 colonists and has suffered an outer hull breach. Due to the need to assist the Constantinople quickly, as well as Graves, Commander Riker recommends a near warp transport to be used to transport an away team to Graves World. Dr. Pulaski suggests to Captain Picard that she remain on the Enterprise D to help treat the injured personnel in the Constantinople, and recommends that Dr. Solar, a Vulcan, go in her place. Solar has Pulaski's full confidence, so Picard agrees. Um, so in a very interesting thing that we actually don't get to see play out, despite I believe what we're watching on Netflix and on Amazon are the remastered versions of the episode, but we don't actually see the Enterprise do anything special on screen for this near warp transport. It seems to me if it was something special, it would be like it suddenly zipped into being out of whatever warp tunnel it was out of, beamed down really quick, and then zipped right back into whatever destination it was heading. Um, there's not a lot of attention to this near warp transport, but anyway,
Yeah, I
um,
made the comment. I think the transwarp thing just made it uh, interesting. It was fun. Like, all right, was this even necessary to do? Just
yeah,
beam them down, go to warp 8 right away, and be done with it.
right. So the main storyline centers around Dr. Ira Graves, who was a human male in an expert in the field of cybernetics, specifically molecular cybernetics. Dr. Graves is believed to be one of the finest scientific minds of his time, and during this episode, Graves is actually going to make the statement that he had actually a relationship with Dr. Noonien Soong, the creator of Data, even going to suggest that Data somewhat owes Graves the respect of being of Graves being his grandfather. So have we caught up to a good place, or
Yes.
oh when
Oh,
they
then
get
one
down
other
to the
thing
planet?
about yeah, Graves has a companion, a younger woman named Karine, and she's the one that I think calls him because he's acting strange, his health is declining, and so forth. And once Dr. Solar and gets down and diagnoses him, finds that he has something called
Darnay's disease.
Darnay's disease, and it's in his terminal stages. They never really state as what Darnay's disease is.
So going to Memory Alpha, which has actually helped me a lot tonight with my notes.
Right.
Um, so Darnay's disease was a terminal illness with no known cure which attacked the central nervous system and the brain. Among its symptoms, symptoms were coughing, pain, shortness of breath, irritability, and erratic behavior. The only time that this shows up is in this episode. So whatever it is, we know that it is a neurological disease.
Right.
But beyond
So
that, there's
so
there's nothing.
it gets to the point with did Graves, before Dr. Solar diagnosed him, did he have any inkling that he was terminally ill? And, you know, whether he did or didn't, once that was confirmed, he was obviously very intelligent. He was very eccentric, and
Hmm.
he had some ideas as to how he could, live on. His consciousness or his knowledge or both could live on. So, with the disease causing him to be somewhat irrational and impulsive and so forth, um, were the things that he did, which we'll get into, caused by him being very suddenly having confirmation that he did not have much time to live, and thus he had all these ideas, and he was able to, before he died, he was able to transfer his consciousness, including his knowledge, into data. Data starts acting strange, and then the story goes on from there.
Right. So I think you pose an interesting question because, at one point Picard, at since we're dealing with this question, at the very end of the episode when Graves has transferred his consciousness to Data and basically overwritten Data's consciousness, there's a confrontation between Graves and Picard in the second level of engineering, where Picard even says, like, you knew that an end was coming, and then by accident Data appears, and then suddenly you decided to make a decision. And I think it was, I think Picard kind of identifies that Graves didn't have this planned. But getting to your larger question, it's interesting because it gets to the question of when did the motive get started to kidnap Data?
And part of his rash response, once it was determined, once he was informed that he had a terminal illness and it seemed like it was very short term, was he not accepting what we talked about before, that there is going to be a physical end? He
I
didn't he,
think
he didn't seem to want to accept that, or he could not accept that, which is why on the sly, very quickly, with intelligence as he was and the technology he knew, he was able to transfer his consciousness into Data. And when you say consciousness, it's the big question is, all right, that was his contra. So, well, I don't know if it's even that. It's too
Katra.
strong.
His
That's too
Katra.
strong of a term, but his consciousness and knowledge. But did the soul transfer over too? And the reason I question that is, once Graves in Data realized that he was doing harm to others, I think at that point he made a moral decision, an ethical decision, that he really wasn't going down the right path, that he really had to accept the end of his physical existence, because he was using Data as an extension of his physical existence. And then the whole cascade ends where Data is found, Data is back to
Cascade is a
normal,
great term, by the way. I'm sorry to
and
continue, but
then Graves's knowledge is put into the Enterprise computer. But then it leaves what they said, his knowledge, but is his consciousness in the computer? It seemed, the way they
right.
described it is like his knowledge was in there, but his consciousness wasn't. So, in terms of Graves achieving immortality by transferring his knowledge into the computer, I don't think he still lived in any way. Now, on the other side, get into the sort of special metaphysics part. You know, if humans have a soul, where did his soul go? That question I don't think is answered here, but it's just something to ponder.
So that's a lot to break into pieces. So let me try taking the larger portion, because you brought up a question about Graves's his moral compass when it comes to facing death on the immediate. Um, I would like to make an observation about the world building that we see in Star Trek to answer this question, if you don't mind.
Please.
Um, so it seems to me, if you look at the world building in Star Trek and some of the ways that um, the Federation goes about researching certain um, topics of interest, like cybernetics or artificial intelligence or warp drive, it seems like they rely on the very best of the best. And one of the things that they seem to do a lot is that they give these scientists huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of power, and huge amounts of latitude and freedom to basically go out into the stars and research however they want. Um, we'll see this actually in, I think, the first or second episode of season 3, when there's this one scientist who's monitoring, I think, some sort of phenomenon that happens between two pulsars. But the point I'm trying to make is that it seems the Federation enables a lot of scientists, if they're very, very talented, a huge amount of leeway. Ira Graves literally has a fucking planet called Graves World. Like, how did this dude get a planet in the Federation? Which seems to be based on this idea that, like, no one is really, terribly rich, but it seems like this guy has so much power, he has a planet named after him, along with his hot blonde, equally smart nurse. So it it seems to me that a lot of these scientists would develop a god complex because, in many ways, they're allowed to. Noonien Soong, Data's creator, for the most part, was given a lot of leeway to develop a positronic brain before he scuttled off in shame because they thought his project was a failure. But even then, even in hiding, he was on Omicron Theta with this highly advanced lab that he somehow dug out of a cave. You just have to ask the question, what kind of psychological profiles does the Federation kind of enable to take part in research? Because the kind of god complex and the swagger and the misogyny and the overconfidence, I'm sorry, the cocksureness of Ira Graves speaks as someone who doesn't think that anything was ever going to go wrong because his intelligence would always win out until he had to face, the human equation, which unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but naturally figures in a physical death. Um, it just seems to me like a lot of these scientists kind of have a god complex until something with real moral weight hits them.
They're kind of like, they're a little bit Frankensteinish.
Oh, this season we're going to review Measure of the Man, which has the doctor who later shows up in Picard. I can't remember his name right now. Commander Maddox. That's it.
Hmm.
Um, because Commander Maddox wants to requisition Data and basically deactivate
Oh, yes.
Data and
Right.
deconstruct him so he can learn how to make more androids with the positronic brain. Um, that there is like they literally have a court case over this one scientist's ability to basically play God over another creature. You know,
Yes.
I think this argument I'm making that the Federation allows scientists to play God a lot is not unfounded. And it just makes me wonder because, you've worked in the sciences and, the business field involving science for most of your career. Are these kind of scientists like Ira Graves prevalent, or it seems to me like there's a philosophy, at least in the scientific world, that demonstrates some sort of sense of restraint that
Oh,
Ira
yeah.
Graves just doesn't have
Well,
at
we
all.
we talked about this, I think, the last episode, that medical research and
Right.
probably research in other areas, you have institutional review boards. So before someone gets the funding and approval to do a medical experiment, particularly when it involves humans, they have to submit their proposal and what data they have from animals or laboratory data, and you know get approval to do it. I'm sure the same thing happens, it should in funding when it comes to uh, geology or physics or aerodynamics and that sort of thing. Somebody has to make the case that if we're asking for $500 million for a project, that they've got to have it really thought out well and so forth, so that scientists. It is very rare that scientists do something which is not reviewed by someone else.
And it seems like there's no one there on Graves' world reviewing whatever Graves does for research, even though it's a priority one subject, whatever he's into when it comes to cybernetics.
Well, and I just think of one thing in terms of reviewing what's being done in a scientific laboratory. One of the big controversies right now is where did the SARS-CoV-2 virus come? Where did the virus come from? Was it a animal to human transfer? Or, excuse me, was this particular coronavirus being studied in the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China? And were they manipulating the virus to make it, to figure out how to, how infectious it could be, not necessarily make into a bioweapon, but as they were working with this new coronavirus, did it somehow get out of the lab into humans? It may have come from a bat originally when it got into the lab, but once they worked with it, was it able to get into a lab technician who left the laboratory, got into the general population in Wuhan, and we know the story from there. And so, it's a matter of, obviously the controversy about that now is we need to understand exactly what happened so we can prevent something like this occurring in the future. But then it gets into, how much control did the ever-seeing communist regime have over this lab? And if they did something wrong, are we ever going to know, as secretive as they are about their internal workings?
I think it's always going to be a question of, you bring up a really important point when comparing China in terms of how much transparency are they really going to give us in terms of letting us into the inner workings of their own virological research? Because, down at the CDC, we're doing the exact same thing. We're developing viruses into more infectious versions just to see if we can develop antibodies or cures or all sorts of treatment just in case, because that's
Well,
really how you prepare for
yeah, it's
future pandemics.
done in Atlanta and it's done at Fort Detrick probably because that's where all of when we were involved in bioweapons or biodefense, all that was done in Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is just in Frederick, Maryland, just northwest of Washington.
But for clarification, I do think that for the sake of the conversation, because what we're talking about is the lab leak hypothesis, and even though we're stepping off we're stepping off the topic of the Schizoid Man for a second, um, I do think it should be made clear, and I think you would agree with me. What happened if this did leak from a lab in Wuhan doesn't necessarily automatically mean that the Chinese leaked this on purpose.
Correct.
and that
Correct.
and that the actual research of creating viruses and more infectious viruses is not necessarily an immoral or ethical thing that they were doing. It's something that is common to actual virological research. And I think that's actually something that's gotten lost in the media in a way. And when we talk about this, it's called the lab leak theory or the lab leak
Right.
hypothesis.
Right.
I think that is something that's often lost in this. And we have had episodes where we have been very critical of China, but I think it's also our responsibility when we talk about this to be mindful that what if China did unintentionally leak SARS-CoV-2 um, to the general populace, it may not have been intentional at all. Which, it's important that we say that because history may be written, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years or 20 years from now, very differently.
It
And I
could.
and I think it's very important that in this moment we try to be as exact as possible.
Yes.
Because,
Yes.
I, kind of not jumping back to Star Trek, but one thing that I've noticed this week in terms of the media, and it's the first week of June 2021, Ben, and whoever's listening. You know, I've been very kind of perplexed by how quickly the media and society is turning on Anthony Fauci in terms of his early. So a lot of his early emails were leaked this week, revealing kind of his uncertainty and his lack of real knowledge about certain things about COVID-19 in the very early months of the pandemic. And I think some of it is very interesting to see the reaction to how we deal with crisis and trauma because from my perspective, if Anthony Fauci was running the operation under Trump to try to figure out how to deal with this thing as it was happening in the very early days, we I remember early on when he said like no one needs to wear masks. And then later on, we definitely needed to wear masks. I think an important thing that's often lost in today's culture and our society is that science often includes the question of I don't know, or I'm sorry, is often revolving around the answer of I don't know. Even if you do an experiment 46 times, there's always going to be an element at the end of it of something you don't know. And that's going to cause you to keep inquiring and investigating and digging deeper into things to understand how the universe around us works.
Well, yeah, I agree with that because I've been for some, I've kind of been all of the, uh, different voices that come from the news, particularly since 2016. I've tried to filter through the news so that there's so much there to pick and choose from. I've tried to
Right.
kind of crunch down and not get overwhelmed by it. And I'm actually in the last couple of weeks somehow become very critical of network news, NBC, CNN. I don't listen to Fox News, of course. I don't listen to MSNBC. I look at CNN online, but it seems like the only news your mother and I watch in the evening generally is the NBC evening news as far as national news. And there's just what they pick and choose and what they present is contradictory at times. And there was one thing that really kind of upset me, which it shouldn't have, but there was a story they did. It was supposed to be a good human interest story about this group of veterans who helped children whose parents were killed as servicemen.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and they put on a 5K race once a year, like near Memorial Day and so forth. And one of the leaders who had started this group said, these children gave their parents to the country. And I heard that and I thought,
Right.
I said, like, bullshit. Those parents were the one that made the choice to join the Army or the Marines. The children didn't make this decision. And that was just such an ass backwards statement to make.
Well,
And I see a lot of this happening in the news right now where people just, oh, the other thing is once, you know, um, getting back to Fauci and CDC, well, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to do this, you don't have to do that. I think the impression is a lot of people given that, oh, the pandemic's over, it's going to go away. It's not gone yet. The number
yeah.
of young people unvaccinated is increasing. They're not dying, but they're having to be, they have to go to the hospital. They're ill enough. The last 2 weeks, or the 2 weeks before last Friday, Bill Maher didn't come on HBO. Turns out, you know why? Because he
It
was
was,
vaccinated, but he came down with COVID.
yeah, well, getting to your general point about the media, I think one problem that we will look back in history, hopefully a decade from now, or maybe many decades from now, hopefully in my lifetime, um, there, just like medicine can't have a profit motive if you're really focused on giving the patient the best care possible. The news cannot be it's the news as it pertains to giving people information as it's as it pertains to the world around them, cannot be connected to a ratings model that's driven by advertising dollars and the effectiveness of those the effectiveness of those advertising dollars. Um, the contradictory nature of media today, especially in America, is built on this idea that um, we as an audience, and this kind of gets back into our conversation about why Star Trek is so calming. Um, the the media, I think, perpetuates three things, and this is my general observation. I haven't really done any great reading into this, but I think the media perpetuates three things. First, it perpetuates the idea that the world is in this internal state of competition and conflict, um, due to a scarcity, and the people that are winning the race are the ones who are able to exploit, um, and organize that scarcity into a system of order that the news in itself supports. The you know CNN is not going to come out and say that Joe Biden is suddenly you know doing a bad job. They can't afford to do that if they want access to them. The second thing I think the media kind of perpetuates is this idea that truth is relative, especially when it comes to human affairs. For example, you can report about the crisis going on in Myanmar, as it pertains to. I'm sorry, I'm using the word pertain a lot, but as it as it surrounds the situation involving the overthrow of the democratically elected government by the military junta, and now forces from the democratically elected government are actually forming a resistance movement that is armed to face off against the junta. You know, the American media is going to present the story of these democratic forces facing off against the military junta and present them as heroes. But they're not going to talk about how these same democratic forces only 2 or 3 years ago helped enable the genocide and the oppression of the Rohingya,
Yes, right.
along the border
Bangladesh.
with Bangladesh. So
Mm.
there's this constant shifting of the flag in terms of what's moral and ethical by the news, where if we're honest, the news would tell us every day, look, humans were imperfect again. These people that were doing these good things at one point are now doing bad things. But that's too hard, I think, of a story to really inform people of every day, and I think people don't want to hear that, which gets to the third thing. Um, in many
That your,
ways,
your your point was just it's hard to shift and determine whose bull's getting gored day after day.
well, especially when everything's constant cattle decapitation.
Yes,
Like they're already selling cattle decapitations every day. So it's not even about who's getting gored. Like the goring's not even the best part. It's watching the cow get cut up.
yeah,
Which gets to the third thing.
right. Go ahead.
Media today perpetuates this idea that somehow news has to be entertaining or the world has to be entertainment. That some and this is almost like throwing bread to the crowds in the Coliseum.
Right, it is. Yeah,
You know, it gets back to that ratings model where somehow news now feels like it has to compete with narrative long form television. Like there's someone at a news agency who feel at CNN who feels like we have to beat Star Trek.
There's
We
there's
have
a
to. Sorry,
there
go on.
there's since I've been taking for fun German lessons on Babel, there was
Right.
an expression I learned today that applies here, and it's Wettbewerb. Alles ist Wettbewerb. Everything is competition.
Right. Well, it's, in some ways, news has become the American gladiators, where it's very much this kind of bubble wrapped presentation. But if you look underneath it, the animus of it is not very good at all. It's not situated in anything beneficial to the human spirit or the human psyche.
I'm having that's the conclusion I'm coming to. Right.
But 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 here's the thing. You're not the only one to come to that conclusion, neither am I. I think the majority of the country, and this is the thing where we're probably going to start losing fans of the show when I start speaking about this. Um, I don't think that the country is socially conservative at all. I think economically it might be a little economically conservative because people just don't understand taxation. But I think if they did, it would become a little bit more economically liberal. But I think socially, the country has become communally very liberal and very progressive, where we now see that the problems around us are so overarching and huge that you can't really face it on a state by state or community by community level. It is really going to take a huge national effort to fix some of these problems. And I think everyone realizes the depth and severity of these problems as it relates to the non reporting of them by the media. Like, the media isn't reporting what is really going on in terms of, our general health, our general safety, our general well-being going into the future. You know, you and I both worry about, I worry about Ben's future, but you worry about my sister's children's future. The news media takes no account of our children's future when it comes to the presentation of their product. Because if it did, it would cease to do many of the things it does on a constant basis in terms of their media and content practices. Like, the news would be much more in depth, and it'd be much more, I think it would be seeking to do a lot more calming and a lot more investigation and a lot more illumination of the topics instead of just kind of prying them for the
I,
red
th-
meat.
I think that they touch on some of these things and trends. They talk about climate change, dealing with that. They talk about improving education. They talk about improving healthcare. But unless you get into something like 60 Minutes or something like that, or some special program on CNN, you don't get it in depth. And one of the things I haven't watched that I probably should watch more is the PBS NewsHour,
Right.
because it's much more to the point. It gets in a little bit more depth because it's a whole hour as opposed to a half hour. I don't know if they have. There's no advertising on there, as I recall. So,
No.
or there's minimal advertising, sort of like social services for the community because it's public broadcasting and so forth. So yeah, I agree with your observations there.
Well, it's what NPR used to be. Like, NPR has become a very slanted radio network since Trump took office in 2016. But I think that has to be reflected too for a moment. I'm sitting here slamming the media a lot, and part of the reason we're doing the show is not only to explore Star Trek, but to explore Star Trek for truth. But since we're sitting here talking about media and talking about the truth, one thing that I hope Ben, when he listens to these in the future, will remember as context to all of this, when Trump came about in 2015, everyone in the media literally underestimated this guy. They literally thought he was not going to become the frontrunner of the GOP, let alone beat Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential race. No one thought that was going to happen. That can't be lost to history. The media were completely mistaken about the time and about the situation. And in those 4 years, he did huge, colossal damage to our trust in terms of our media organizations, in terms of
Yes.
how information is vetted and processed. Um, Trump has done a lot of damage by himself to the media. And it's actually been very eye-opening because it seems to me the institutions that are reliant on truth and fact in terms of the information they gather weren't able to withstand a a huge font of misinformation from one person. And it just makes you think, the Russians have, of course, been doing disinformation and misinformation campaigns for decades now against us. But whatever the Russians did, it never equaled the torrential damage that one man did in a 4 year period within office. And I think that has to be reflected too in terms of the power of human influence within one person, and the power of charisma and the power of character, even if that character is awful. Like, Donald Trump really did something Herculean, even though it was terrible and awful that he did it. And I think we just need to recognize that, like, everything is vulnerable if you're not careful. And the media was not careful in any way, shape, or form when it
And
came to this guy.
if you're
And
well
they
here you
continue not to be during 2016 to 2020. If anything, the media made his 4 years worse.
well, and with what you're saying is that even with NPR, is everybody had to adjust to this very
Oh, I
strange, dysfunctional media environment that Trump created. And we're still not through it yet. And that's sort of what I'm seeing. Plus, then you've got the pandemic that upset everything so much.
can I make an illusion? Um, and I think that I'm going to make a very brutal, violent illusion, but I think that this is apt. Donald Trump took a baseball bat and literally brained the media apparatus in the head. It's So you've been in morgues, Dad. So, early on in your career, you went in and you harvested corneas. So you've seen some pretty horrible acts, some pretty horrible trauma, right? Physically?
Yes.
You'd agree with that, right?
Yes.
So Donald Trump took a baseball bat and literally swung it as hard as he could at the back of the media's head. Forget COVID for a second. Like, he did damage on a level that they weren't ready for. So I don't think it was an adjustment. I just don't. I think they were in a concussion and that they
You-
couldn't adjust.
You're calling up the scene from The Untouchables
Yes,
with when Robert De Niro as Capone bashed the guy's brains in with the baseball bat at the dinner.
exactly. But
Yes.
that's what Donald Trump did. He took the process, he literally executed it in front of everyone, and the media spent the next 4 years literally running around in a panic. They didn't have control of the narrative, and they didn't have control of the situation. They didn't know how to report or really respond to this guy. I mean, uh, and we need to get back to the show, so this is going to be the last thing I want to say
Sure.
about
Go
it.
ahead. Yeah.
One thing that I thought was shameful outlets like CNN did is that they started picking reporters that were going to be openly antagonistic against Trump in public, in person, and against his mediaries. Um, in CNN's case, that was Jim Acosta. And the media went out of their way to hold Jim Acosta up as a hero. But if you look at what Jim Acosta was doing, Jim Acosta was there to literally antagonize the president during his media briefings, the few that he gave, because Trump became very authoritarian and refused to give a lot of media engagements because we knew his shit was evil, they literally sent someone there to poke the bear.
Hmm.
And there's no point in poking the bear because all that does is poke the bear, and the bear's just going to damage things. The media, however, lionized these sort of reporters and their reporting, and it was irresponsible. And I think we just have to take into account that, like, this sort of human irresponsibility in the midst of panic produces far worse results than they do anything positive, which brings us back to Ira Graves.
Yes, perfect. Yes,
Perfect transition. So,
yes,
you know, let's dig into your question, because I think we got people to the main thrust that, Ira, the away team comes down, they diagnose Ira Graves' Darnay's disease. He's going to die, and he has this interaction with Data where, they have the conversation about, uh, is Graves scared to die? Issues of pain and lust and envy. Graves has Data call him Grandpa, and of course he whistles to "If I Only Had a Heart," which is from The Wizard of
The Wizard of
Oz,
Oz, right?
which is actually very important because the story of Wizard of Oz involves, in Data's case, the Tin Man, who in Frank Oz's story is looking for a heart, and in the end actually discovers that he had a heart all along. He's given a medal. His heart is supposed to demonstrate his compassion in the story. But this is basically another episode where we're reaffirming Data's actual humanness
Yes,
versus, interestingly, I think one thing that the stories in these episodes seem to do is offer Data's humanness and use a human as an actual counterpoint to it to define it for us. Because while Data is very human in his outlook and his treatment of others, it is usually a human that comes along and shows their inhumanity as a way to help us better explore that.
and I think that I just had the thought that thinking about we talked frequently about is Data human? How human is he? He is human. Uh, Nun Yang song, made him
Soon. It's so
soon
hard.
did a really good job in the engrams, the human thinking patterns that he put into the positronic brain. And I think what we see throughout Next Generation, it's not a question as to whether Data is human, is what we see him as becoming more human.
I,
He grows. He grows. It's sort of like you could make the say if you have a young child, they're human, but as they understand things more, as they have experiences, they're educated and so forth, their humanity changes, it grows. Just because
right.
of how they can interact more effectively, uh, more actively with their environment and with other people.
Well, getting into the transformation that Data undergoes when Graves implants his personality over Data's natural neural net. One thing that I think the writers of Star Trek are also believers of are the inherent goodness or maybe the inherent evilness of certain people. Like, for example, um, Soong invents Data, and Data seems to be naturally good, but he also invented Lore,
Lore.
and we know
Yeah.
that Lore, even with the emotion chip, has this kind of natural malignance or maliciousness to him. So there is this kind of idea that some people are born bad and some people are born good.
It's kind of
And
like God. Why does God let Lucifer exist?
exactly. Well, I think it's also, in getting into the Ira Graves character for a moment, this story is really an exploration about dealing with the deep challenge of death versus the long-standing ego we hold through life. You know, Ira is trying to preserve his consciousness and his life because he believes his potential is not yet fulfilled. And I think that's a very natural thing that we all fear when it comes to the issue of death, that sometime our time will approach, it will come for us. And the things that we wish we would have done, we will not have, and that will be somehow our great regret right in the end. And in many ways, a hell in itself, all the things that we don't do. I think that the Ira Graves character is playing with that notion that we live with this kind of longing for the things that we haven't seen ourselves done, to the point where when we have to face the inevitable, we actually turn into something far less than we think ourselves to be.
Well, here's a comment to that. I've heard some people say, or some people write, that when someone dies, that as long as other people remember them, in some ways they're still alive.
Yes.
Um, so when Graves transfers his knowledge into the computer, but we don't know whether it seems like his consciousness is not in the computer. At that point, he really has, physically died. He's going to be remembered because he's an historical figure. You have his papers, you have his inventions, and so forth. But once he puts his knowledge in the computer, that's not, the sense of immortality. Now, I compare that with the last note. One of the things I thought about this, and this gets into a sort of a religious, spiritual thing. When Jesus was crucified, and
Right.
then the New Testament says on the third day he rose again from the dead physically. Some people believe, most Christians believe that. There might be Christians who question that.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is the fact that is Christ's resurrection, is the importance of his resurrection, his physical resurrection, and then he ascended into heaven, or is what's really important is that what he did and what he taught still persist.
So you get into a very, I think it's a very important question, a very good
Because
one.
because because I'm at the point in my Christian oriented spirituality, for lack of a better term, is
Whoa.
I don't if it is if someone claims to be a Christian, if they
Yeah.
have doubts about the physical resurrection, that might be okay. Because what's really important is to understand and try to apply what Jesus represented and what Jesus taught.
It's a question of what matters more, the message or the moment. Um,
Yes.
for example, I think a lot of people. So one topic that I'm reading a lot into today, and a lot of people in my generation are reading into, and all generations are reading to, just in the wake of George Floyd and Michael Brown and Ferguson, going all the way back to Trayvon Martin. There's a lot of reading now into anti-racism, and one thing that I think is often lost in history, the more I read into this, and the more I just read into critical theory. Um, I think one part of our culture that we don't really understand is how often we take the moment for granted and completely lose the message. For example, let's take Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream" speech. Really important speech that he gave on the mall in front in front of the Washington Monument. Is that
In
what it
front of
was?
the Lincoln Memorial, right at the head of the
Lincoln
reflecting
Memorial,
pole.
right in front of the reflecting pole in front of the Lincoln Memorial. I'm sorry. It's late. But if you really just focus on that speech, and that's the only thing you know as a white person, that speech, the only thing you know about Martin Luther King is that he wants to be judged by the content of his character, and he thinks that the only thing that we should be doing is judging each other by the content of our character. However, that's just a moment in King's long and storied career, and a small fragment of the many things that he said in terms of his ministry and in terms of his protests for the sake of civil rights, including how white moderates can't sit by and simply let methods of white supremacy they're comfortable with take control because they are comfortable with them. Also, looking, if you really want to address racism, you have to address power, including your own, and just a whole host of things when it came to the treatment of the poor. There's an argument he may have been assassinated not um, because of his actions in the civil rights movement, but because he was on his way to put together a poor people's campaign. The story and the messages of King are very different from the one moment we have from the I have a dream speech. But I'm sorry, I'm kind of bumbling here because again it's late and I'm tired. Um, we are mistaking the moment for and losing the larger message of what that moment really encapsulates. The entire idea of we should judge people by the content of their character is the thesis of Martin Luther King's general statements on race. But underneath that, it's also you have to address power, you have to address your own biases, you have to address your own discriminatory beliefs. It's a whole host of other things that take actual work and self reflection that kind of get lost because we just remember the guy in front of the microphone.
Well, to expand on this further, conversations you and I've had in the past, the
Same thing
message.
with Jesus too. But
Well, they're getting back to that because it's the message where, you know, in the early church, particularly when you get to what was that controversy and so forth, where you get before Nicaea and all that, they got
the Arian
all
controversy.
the Arian controversy. They got into all this gobbledygook about what the actual nature of Christ was and so
Hmm.
on. And when you look back, it's like, was that really important versus the message? Because if you really take, at least what I get from Jesus's message today, if that would have been applied in Western civilization, as Rome fell and, Christianity is something that held the Roman Empire together and destroyed it at the same time. If Jesus' principles had have been applied, then the way we treat each other right now, it would be totally different.
So this episode's going all over the place, but
It is.
it's fun. So can I even get more granular than that?
Go ahead.
So people focus on the death and resurrection, but they don't focus on the thing Jesus did right before he died. What did Jesus do right before he died?
He asked his father to forgive the people that put him to death.
Exactly. Is that act God God asking God essentially to forgive the people who've persecuted him? Is that message the ability to be magnanimous in the face of your enemy? Is that message more important than what happens in the very next breath?
No, because it's really the basis for the forgiveness of sin that people have to be able to forgive them. If they acknowledge the sin, then an individual has to be able to forgive themselves for it,
But what
which is
but
something
so,
that comes up on another show we are watching.
but but so therefore you agree with me essentially Jesus forgiving right before he dies is more important than him dying.
Yes,
So like that again, that is the message versus the
the
moment.
moment. Yes, right.
So, I think that there is a really important thing that you're pointing to here in terms of, in some ways, it gets to Ira Grave. Like, I think Ira is worried about he is going to miss out on all these moments when his knowledge is going to last forever and actually add to the greater progress of humanity or the Federation as it goes forward. But, I think there is also an existential fear there that should be addressed because I think of this one as a writer, as a fantasy author, I haven't quote unquote made it yet in any great estimation. There is a worry that, at some point I'm going to meet my end and maybe I wouldn't have done anything in the field that I was so passionate about. But the idea that like my work will live on someplace in a library or just be added to the greater body
Hmm.
of the discipline and art and craft I've chosen to dedicate so much of my life to, I think that there is an immortality in that. Like, the fact that we still talk about the Bible 2000 years after these stories were first being forged and then, canonized in the 15th century. The fact that we're still talking about this speaks Christ never officially died as far as I'm concerned because we keep talking about him.
That is my point. That is where he continues to live.
Well, I think that that is an important message that you're bringing up here, that Ira Graves is really kind of facing this existential crisis without realizing the importance of what he might be able to do here. Because in some ways, when Data shows up, I think you're right in the panic. He does jump to Data, but I think if Data hadn't shown up, he would have transferred his consciousness anyway. And it would have been this massive achievement that he just wouldn't have been there for. It still would have
Well,
been
and the
gigantic.
one point we didn't touch on that's important is I think that he had this. He was older. He had this attraction to Kareen,
Right.
and Kareen saw him more of a father figure. But he would have liked he as a younger man he had been had many relationships with women and so forth, and he missed that. So when this opportunity came up that he could transfer his consciousness and knowledge into Data, then that gave him the opportunity to try to say, Kareen, look, we can have a relationship now. And she actually made a very important decision about immortality and accepting the humanness and the fact that you'll age and die and so forth when she said, I don't want to be like you. I don't want to be transferred into a artificial being like Data. I like Data, but that's not what I want to do. And
Right.
I think that was where Graves started to realize, maybe I've gone down the wrong path here.
Well, I think it's also, in many ways, when Graves transfers his consciousness into Data's body and supersedes Data to take over Data's body, he does assume kind of a godlike status where he is
Mm-hmm.
now embodied with this superhuman vessel. In many ways, I've been using this term a lot since I've read it. A lot of people are like dogs; they spend their time chasing a car. Well, Graves caught a bus. I think Graves, in finding this answer that he thinks is going to save him and provide him with this immortality to continue his vaunted career, he is suddenly overwhelmed with the fact that he has so much power in his control that he is almost out of control with it. It
Yes.
really gets into the question of like, if, and it gets, I don't know if you remember that Jim Carrey movie, Bruce Almighty. Um, it really gets to the question of, if you suddenly had all this power and you had immortality and you, to a certain extent, Data has omniscience. Like, he has this virtual library in his head of everything that's going on in Starfleet at the time, and he also seems to be hooked to the Enterprise computer. in many ways, Data is a embodied version of a god, and Graves is suddenly gifted that to himself. Suddenly gifted that to himself. I think there's a message here being told of like when you are given too much power, not only is it corrupt, it overwhelms. You know, I've been reading a little bit about Napoleon Bonaparte recently, and a lot of his downfall, like leading up to the Battle of Waterloo and everything. You know, part of it is that Napoleon was, he really was a brilliant soldier and a really brilliant tactician. He was legitimately everything that he said he was. The problem was it just got to be too much for him. It's not that he wasn't brilliant enough or that he didn't have enough strategy. There just wasn't enough time and there wasn't enough miles in his head to cover all that he needed to cover. I think when Graves gets to become Data and he suddenly realizes, like, I can just flick my hand and hurt everybody, he suddenly realizes, man, I can just flick my hand and hurt everybody and not even think of it. And he does hurt a lot of people until he hurts Kareen. And it's Picard reminding him, like, hey, you hurt her and you didn't even think about it. That you're right, it does stop him. But I think it's because he's suddenly realizing that, like, I stepped into something that I can't really
Right. Yeah.
fathom.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that's an interesting thing about consciousness as well. Like, there's still Graves still has an inherent sense of self separate from Data when he goes into Data's body that makes
And
him realize, like,
Troy picks that out or states that. Yeah.
right. And Troy's able to find two different consciousnesses within
Hmm.
Data, which is
Hmm.
interesting because there's other episodes where Troy can't actually read Data because Data doesn't have, like, a traditional consciousness for her to pick up on. But suddenly she can pick up on two. I think uh, now that we're bringing this up, and I didn't even think about it until now, I think Data is not only human, I think he might be better than human. If I'm Well, think about it. So Troy, Troy, never is able to pick up Data's consciousness because Data's an android. However, once Graves is in Data's android body, she's able to pick up two, which means does actually have a consciousness and does have a consciousness that she can pick up on. It's just in its natural, uninhibited, unadulterated state. Without Graves,
Right.
she
Exactly.
can't read
Yeah.
it,
Yeah. I understand. Yeah. I
which
got that.
means Data is an evolved being that somehow has skipped the Betazoid. Like, if Data was an enemy soldier and you dropped him on Betazed, all of Betazoid's basically fucked because this is a predator that's hyper evolved.
This is interesting because we talk about is Data human, and I said that, yeah, he's human. The Data's challenge is he cannot accept himself as human because he's not a total biologic being, but he is human and he constantly improves his humanness. And because he can do that in such and sometimes grand leaps and bounds, he probably is a better human than regular humans.
Do you know what I think Data has that us as real humans often don't, which makes him a better human? Restraint. Data has a
Hmm.
natural sense of restraint that, like,
Hmm.
Ira Graves doesn't have.
Right,
And it's
right.
inherent today that Data's like, okay, there's certain things I can't do, and I
Hmm.
know I can't do them, so I shouldn't cross this boundary until I'm really sure I'm ready to try
Right,
this thing. Whether
right,
it's humor or having a relationship
right,
or all sorts of human things. He has a sense of restraint that I think all of us just don't have to a certain extent or don't
right,
develop
right.
without real reckonings. Um,
I think
you
we've
know,
covered pretty much everything.
yeah, there
There
are
was
some fun things that I do want to touch on.
Well, one
Um,
thing I wanted to mention is, that you mentioned since we talked about Martin Luther King, that he was a Star Trek fan. He would watch Star Trek with his kids,
Oh, right.
and he was the one that when Nichelle Nichols felt like she was not getting good roles, and she wanted to leave, he said, "No, you have to stay because look what you're representing, an
Right.
intelligent black woman in a responsible position in the future." And she
Well,
said, "I got it." And I read a story about her recently that she went on and was a consultant to NASA and helped choose a huge number of actual astronauts.
oh, Nichelle Nichols is basically the saint of space exploration, and no one knows it. Like, Uhura has done
Exactly.
so much to push
Exactly.
our cosmological bounds forward.
Yes. It's
Honestly,
amazing.
if the thing that, and I know that we've touched a lot on the topic of race and American history tonight, but before we leave on this, I think this should be said. It's June 2021, and this nation is starting to have a real reckoning with the crimes that we've put to the side and forgotten because I think the guilt of them are truly monumental to deal with. Like,
Hmm. Tulsa.
talking about Tulsa, I don't know how I as a white I can only speak for myself. I don't know how I as a white man can sit here and not look at the history of America in the past and not really question the stories I've been told because I really have lived historically a life of innate privilege that other people haven't had the opportunity to have and in many ways have had taken from them. I don't think that this moment that we're having in history is not just about pointing at white people and exposing our guilt. If anything, I think this is our chance to exercise that guilt by taking responsibility for the things that our culture helped to enact upon others, which were really evil and terrible. But at the same time, also expunge this evil and save our souls. Like, I think that this is our moment to really save our souls and to reach out to the people that we've harmed and say that we're sorry and that we're listening and that, I think about this a lot when it comes to you, Ben. Um, I just want to raise you to be good to other humans. And I think now, knowing what we know, that if we're going to be good humans to each other, we have to take responsibility for the things we do, which is ultimately what Picard asked Graves to do. Jumping back into the episode, at the end, Picard says, Graves, at some point, you're mindlessly going about doing things without realizing the consequences of them. You're getting all the benefit without realizing the cost that others have to pay for it. If you if you're truly responsible, you're going to take this into effect and you're going to put your power down and you're just going to accept the way things are going to be. Like some things end. We're seeing the end of a white hegemony, but what's going to be in its place, I think it's going to be better because it's going to be more inclusive. And yeah, it might be more diverse, but ultimately it's going to be a better reflection of humanity. And
Yes.
I think that's what this show's about.
It is.
Ultimately,
It
it's
is.
about us
Yes.
finding our better joined unified version of humanity where we see the face of our greater selves in each other and in everyone else. And I think what Roddenberry's ultimately pushing is the idea that like that inherent dignity is not human, it is cosmic. And it is cosmic within the Klingon, as it is cosmic within the Romulan, as it is cosmic within that Borg drone, even though we have to rescue that Borg drone. Um, but I think that that dignity that we're trying to explore in these episodes and explore in this show and ultimately explore for the betterment of each other resides in all of us as it is already. And it already resides in Data. So at the end of that rant, Dad, thank you for joining me. I think
Yes.
that we had a good, wild conversation.
We did.
Um, We will be back next time for Star Trek Season 2, Episode 7, Unnatural Selection. And we'll see everyone then. Thank you for joining us for Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. Thanks, Dad.
Thanks, Jay. Good night now.
Night.